Let's start with something that confuses a lot of people, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. Emotional distance doesn't kill attraction. In many cases, it intensifies it. Avoidant individuals don't operate from the same emotional playbook most people are used to. They don't lean in when connection deepens. They lean back. And that subtle shift, that moment where availability becomes distance, creates a psychological tension that the human brain is wired to respond to. Because desire at its core is not built on comfort. It's built on anticipation, uncertainty, and the possibility of loss. When someone is consistently available, predictable, and emotionally open, your nervous system relaxes. That's where safety and long-term bonding grow. But when someone becomes slightly out of reach, when their attention is inconsistent, your mind starts to fill in the gaps. You begin to think about them more, analyze their behavior, replay conversations, and search for meaning in the smallest details. This is where avoidants, often unintentionally, become powerful catalysts for attraction. Their distance creates a question mark, and the human brain is deeply uncomfortable with unanswered questions. So what do? We lean in, we try harder, we invest more energy, not necessarily because the connection is objectively deeper, but because it feels unfinished. And unfinished emotional experiences tend to occupy more psychological space than complete ones. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. The inconsistency, the moments of warmth followed by withdrawal, activates the brain's reward system in a very specific way. It's similar to what happens in gambling. When rewards are unpredictable, they become more addictive. You don't know when the next win is coming, so you stay engaged longer, hoping to recreate that initial high. So when an avoidant gives you attention, presence, even intimacy, it feels amplified. And when they pull back, it doesn't just feel like distance, it feels like loss. And loss is one of the most powerful emotional drivers we have. But here's the truth most people miss. The intensity you feel in these moments is not always a reflection of genuine connection. It's often a reflection of emotional scarcity. You're not just responding to who they are. You're responding to how rarely they show up. And the mind starts to equate rarity with value. Philosophically, this taps into something deeper about human nature. We are meaning-making creatures. When something is unclear, we don't leave it neutral. We assign significance to it. So the avoidant silence becomes mysterious. Their independence becomes strength. Their emotional distance becomes depth. But in many cases, it's not depth. It's simply distance. And if you're not aware of this dynamic, you can mistake emotional unavailability for emotional complexity. You can confuse the feeling of chasing with the feeling of loving. That's why people often say, I've never felt this way before, and they're right, but not always for the reason they think. What they're feeling is not just connection, it's activation. It's the nervous system being pulled into a cycle of anticipation, and that can feel incredibly powerful. But power and stability are not the same thing. So as you begin to understand this, you start to ask a different question. Not why am I so drawn to this person, but what is this dynamic doing to my perception of them? Because once you see that emotional distance can manufacture desire, you stop blindly trusting intensity as a measure of compatibility. And that awareness changes everything. Because the moment you stop chasing what feels just out of reach is the moment you start seeing things as they really are. And once you begin to see how emotional distance can manufacture desire, the next layer becomes even more complex. Because avoidants don't just create distance, they often redefine what intimacy even means. For many avoidant individuals, physical connection and emotional vulnerability are not tightly linked. In fact, they can be experienced as two entirely separate domains. This means they can show up fully in moments of passion, presence, even intensity, and yet remain psychologically guarded at the same time. Now for the person on the receiving end, this feels incredibly confusing because what do we normally associate with physical closeness? We associate it with trust, with openness, with a kind of emotional progression. We assume that if someone is letting us in physically, they must also be letting us in emotionally. But that assumption doesn't always hold true here. Avoidants can engage in intimacy without experiencing it as exposure. Where others might feel seen, they feel in control. Where others feel bonded, they feel momentarily connected, and then able to step back without the same emotional residue. And that creates a very specific kind of dynamic. You may experience moments that feel deeply real. Eye contact, chemistry, shared energy, and your mind naturally builds a narrative around it. This means something. This is growing. We're getting closer. But for them, it may not carry the same weight. Not because they're intentionally deceptive, but because their internal wiring processes closeness differently. Emotional vulnerability can feel overwhelming, even threatening. So instead of gradually deepening both physical and emotional intimacy together, they allow one while restricting the other. This is where the term dangerous starts to make more sense. Not in a malicious way, but in a psychological one. Because when physical intimacy is present without emotional grounding, it creates an imbalance. One person begins to attach meaning while the other maintains distance. One person feels the connection expanding while the other is carefully containing it. And that gap is where confusion grows. It can feel intoxicating at first. There's freedom in it, a sense of spontaneity, a lack of pressure. You're not weighed down by heavy conversations or defined expectations. Everything feels alive in the moment, but over time, something starts to surface. A question, where is this actually going? And that's where many people find themselves stuck, because the physical connection feels too real to dismiss, yet the emotional connection feels too inconsistent to rely on. So they try to bridge the gap. They open up more, they give more, they hope that if they deepen the emotional side, it will naturally bring the other person along with them, but avoidants don't move that way. In fact, the more emotional weight that enters the dynamic, the more likely they are to retreat. Not because they don't feel anything, but because what they feel begins to exceed what they're comfortable managing. So what you're left with is a paradox. Moments of closeness that feel profound, paired with an emotional ceiling that never quite lifts. And if you're not aware of this pattern, you can start to internalize it. You might think, maybe I'm asking for too much, or maybe this is just how modern relationships work. But it's not about asking for too much. It's about asking the right person. Because true intimacy is not just about access to someone's body. It's about access to their inner world, their fears, their thoughts, their contradictions, their truth. And when those two things are out of sync, the connection may feel exciting, but it will rarely feel secure. So the real question becomes, are you experiencing connection or are you experiencing proximity without depth? Because the difference between those two will determine whether this becomes something meaningful or something that simply feels that way in the moment. And if you don't learn to recognize that difference, you won't just misread the connection. You'll start misreading yourself. And when you combine that separation of physical and emotional intimacy with the pattern we're about to explore, you begin to understand why these connections feel so intense, yet so unstable at the same time. Because avoidants don't just create distance, they create rhythm. A very specific rhythm, one that pulls you in, then pushes you away. At first, it feels natural, even exciting. There's a moment where they open up, where they're present, engaged, maybe even deeply charming. You feel seen, chosen. There's a spark of connection that feels real and immediate. And just as you begin to settle into that feeling, just as your mind starts to say, okay, this is going somewhere, something shifts, they withdraw. Not always dramatically. Sometimes it's subtle. A change in tone, a delay in communication, a slight emotional absence where there was once presence, but the impact is the same. The energy you were responding to is no longer there. And now, without realizing it, you've entered a cycle. This push-pull dynamic isn't rando. It operates on a psychological level that directly interacts with how the human brain processes reward and attachment. When connection is consistent, the brain stabilizes. But when connection is intermittent, it becomes heightened. This is what's known as intermittent reinforcement. One of the most powerful behavioral conditioning mechanisms we know. It's the same principle that keeps people hooked in environments where rewards are unpredictable. Because when you don't know when the next moment of closeness is coming, you become more focused, more invested, more attentive. You start to track patterns, you analyze behavior, you try to decode what caused the shift. Did I say something wrong? Did I move too fast? Was that moment even real? And in doing so, your attention becomes consumed not just by the person, but by the pattern. That's where the real attachment begins to form. Not necessarily from who they are consistently, but from the contrast between who they are when they are fully present and who they become when they pull away. Because those moments of closeness, they feel earned. And anything that feels earned tends to feel more valuable. So when they come back, and they usually do, it creates relief, even excitement. The connection feels renewed, sometimes even stronger than before. And your brain registers that as a reward. But what it's actually reinforcing is the cycle itself. Pull in, push away, reconnect, repeat. Now here's the deeper layer most people don't consider. This dynamic doesn't just create emotional intensity, it alters perception. It makes you focus on the highs while rationalizing the lows. You begin to measure the relationship not by its stability, but by its peaks. And that's a dangerous metric, because a connection defined by emotional spikes will always feel more powerful than one defined by consistency, but it won't necessarily be more real or more sustainable. Philosophically, this speaks to a fundamental tension in human nature. We crave both certainty and excitement. But when those two are out of balance, excitement tends to win in the short term, even if it costs us clarity in the long term. So you stay in it. Not because it's meeting your needs consistently, but because it occasionally exceeds them in ways that feel unforgettable, and those moments become the justification for everything else. But here's the reality. A relationship should not require emotional withdrawal to feel alive. It should not depend on absence to create appreciation. And it should not lead you constantly trying to regain something that disappears as soon as it arrives. Because when connection becomes a cycle instead of a foundation, you're no longer building something, you're reacting to it. And the longer you stay in that pattern, the harder it becomes to distinguish between genuine connection and conditioned response. So the question you have to ask yourself is not, how do I get back to the high? But why does it only exist between the highs? Because once you see that clearly, the dynamic loses its power, and you stop mistaking emotional turbulence for emotional depth. And as you begin to understand that cycle, the pull, the distance, the return, another layer reveals itself. And this one is even more subtle because it doesn't feel like distance at first. It feels like alignment. Avoidants, especially in the early stages, can be incredibly perceptive. They pick up on your energy, your values, your emotional language. And without necessarily intending to manipulate, they reflect it back to you with remarkable precision. You talk about your passions, they resonate. You share your perspective, they agree. You express emotional depth, they meet you there. Sometimes even amplifying it. And in those moments, it feels like you found someone who truly gets you, not just on the surface, but on a deeper, almost intuitive level. And that feeling is powerful, because being understood is one of the most fundamental human desires. When someone mirrors your inner world, it creates a sense of familiarity, even safety. You start to think, this is rare, this is different, this is real. But here's where the dynamic begins to shift. Because what feels like deep alignment can sometimes be a form of adaptive connection, not fully rooted in sustained emotional availability, but in present moment responsiveness. They are attuned, yes, but attunement is not the same as consistency. So in the beginning, they meet you where you are, they reflect your depth, your curiosity, your emotional tone, and because of that, you begin to open up more. You invest more. You reveal more of yourself. And then, just as that emotional exposure deepens, something changes. They begin to withdraw that same level of engagement. The conversations become less layered. The responsiveness becomes less intuitive. The emotional presence that once felt so natural starts to feel selective, even unpredictable. And now you're left trying to understand what happened, because it wasn't always like this. That's what makes this pattern so psychologically impactful. It's not that something was never there, it's that something was there, and then it changed. So your mind doesn't question whether the connection exists. It questions why it's no longer consistent. And in that questioning, you begin to turn inward. Did I misread it? Did I reveal too much? Was that version of them real? But often, the more accurate question is this: was that version of them sustainable? Because mirroring, when it's not grounded in stable emotional availability, creates an illusion of DA. P thin without the structure to support it long term. It's like building a connection on reflection rather than foundation. And reflections, by nature, shift depending on what's in front of them. This is where people can start chasing not just the person, but the version of the person they experienced in the beginning. The one who seemed fully present, fully aligned, fully engaged. And the more that version fades, the more valuable it becomes in your mind. You start to think, if I can just get back to that, everything will make sense again. But here's the truth. What you experienced may have been real in the moment, but it wasn't necessarily stable over time. And that distinction matters, because real connection is not just about how deeply someone can meet you once, it's about how consistently they can stay with you as things evolve. Philosophically, this speaks to the difference between resonance and commitment. Resonance is immediate. It feels natural, almost effortless. But commitment is revealed over time through consistency, through presence that doesn't disappear when things become more complex. So when someone mirrors your depth and then withdraws it, it doesn't just create confusion. It creates a kind of emotional dissonance. You're holding on to an experience that no longer matches reality. And that gap can keep you invested far longer than clarity would, because you're not just relating to who they are now, you're relating to who they showed you they could be. And that's a powerful hook. But the longer you stay attached to that initial reflection, the harder it becomes to accept the pattern that follows it. So the question you have to ask is not, was it real? But is it repeatable? Because connection that cannot be sustained will always leave you trying to recreate something that only existed once. And the moment you recognize that, you stop chasing reflections and start choosing reality. And once you begin to let go of the version of them you first experienced, you start to see another force at play, one that doesn't rely on inconsistency or intensity, but on something far more subtle: perception. Avoidants often carry an aura of independence that on the surface is deeply attractive. They don't seem needy. They don't appear to rely on others for emotional stability. They move through the world with a kind of self-containment that many people admire, especially in a culture that equates independence with strength. And at first glance, it looks like confidence. They're not constantly seeking validation. They're not over-explaining themselves. They don't rush to define the relationship or anchor it in certainty. There's space around them. And that space creates intrigue, because when someone doesn't fully reveal themselves, your mind naturally leans in to fill the gaps. This is where mystery begins to take shape. But here's the critical distinction. Mystery is not the same as depth. Mystery is simply the absence of information. Depth is the presence of substance. And when you don't have enough information about someone, your brain doesn't stay neutral. It becomes creative. It starts projecting meaning, imagining layers, assigning qualities that may or may not be there. You begin to interpret their silence as thoughtfulness, their distance as emotional control, their unpredictability as complexity. In other words, you start to build a story, and the less they clarify, the more room that story has to grow. Philosophically, this taps into a very human tendency, the need to make sense of what we don't understand. We are not comfortable with ambiguity, especially in relationships. So when clarity is missing, we don't wait for it, we construct it. And often we construct it in a way that elevates the other person. Because if someone feels significant to us, we want there to be a reason. So their independence becomes admirable. Their lack of emotional expression becomes restraint. Their unwillingness to fully engage becomes a sign that they're different from everyone else. But what's actually happening is much simpler. They are maintaining distance. And that distance is allowing you to project qualities onto them that haven't been consistently demonstrated. Now, this doesn't mean avoidants lack depth or emotional capacity. It means that their way of relating often limits how much of that depth is accessible to you. And when access is limited, perception becomes the dominant force. You're no longer responding to what is clearly shown. You're responding to what is partially hidden. And what's hidden always carries more psychological weight than what's known. This is why people often feel a stronger pull towards someone they don't fully understand than someone who is open and consistent. Because clarity removes ambiguity, and ambiguity fuels imagination. But imagination is not connection. And over time, this dynamic can lead you further away from reality. You may find yourself defending their behavior, justifying their distance, or holding onto a version of them that exists more in your interpretation than in their actual actions. And the more you invest in that interpretation, the harder it becomes to step back and see things objectively. So what started as attraction begins to shift into projection. And projection, when left unchecked, can keep you emotionally attached to something that isn't fully there. This is where awareness becomes critical, because the moment you start distinguishing between what you know about someone and what you're assuming about them, the illusion begins to lose its grip. You stop being captivated by what's hidden and start paying attention to what's consistently revealed. And that shift changes the entire dynamic, because real connection doesn't require you to guess, to interpret, or to fill in emotional blanks. It reveals itself over time through clarity, through presence, through actions that align with words. So the question is not, why do they feel so intriguing? But what do I actually have evidence of? Because once you anchor yourself in that question, mystery stops being magnetic and starts being measurable. And when you begin to anchor yourself in what is real rather than what is imagined, the final layer of this dynamic comes into focus. And this is where it becomes deeply personal. Because at a certain point, this is no longer just about the avoidant. It's about what the interaction is activating within you. Avoidants have a way of touching something deeper than surface level attraction. Their patterns, the distance, the inconsistency, the partial availability often intersect with unresolved emotional imprints that many people carry without fully realizing it, especially those who lean toward anxious attachment. Now, this isn't about labeling or blaming. It's about understanding how two different relational styles can lock into each other in a way that feels powerful, but is often rooted in something much older than the relationship itself. Because when someone gives you just enough connection to feel hope, but not enough to feel secure, it can awaken a very specific emotional drive, the need to earn closeness. And for many people, that drive is not new. It echoes earlier experiences where love felt conditional, where attention had to be maintained, where emotional consistency wasn't guaranteed, where connection came with uncertainty. So when you encounter someone who recreates that emotional pattern, it doesn't just feel liar. It feels important. It feels like something you need to resolve. So you invest more. You become more attentive, more patient, more willing to adapt. You try to understand them, support them, give them space, all in the hope that eventually the connection will stabilize. But what's really happening is that an old emotional loop is being reactivated. You're not just responding to who they are now, you're responding to what they represent on a deeper level, a chance to finally experience consistency where there once was unpredictability. And that's why it becomes so hard to walk away. Because leaving doesn't just feel like losing the person. It can feel like abandoning the possibility of resolving something unfinished within yourself. But here's the truth that changes everything. No relationship can heal a pattern that it is actively reinforcing. If the dynamic itself is built on inconsistency, then no amount of effort within that dynamic will create stability. You can't solve unpredictability by investing more into it. And this is where clarity becomes not just helpful, but necessary. Because once you recognize that the intensity you're feeling is tied to activation rather than alignment, you gain a different kind of power. You stop asking, how do I make this work? And start asking, what is this teaching me about my own patterns? That shift is profound. It moves you from reaction to awareness, from chasing to choosing. And philosophically, it brings you face to face with a fundamental question. Are you seeking connection from a place of wholeness or from a place of unresolved need? Because those two places create very different outcomes. When you seek connection from wholeness, you're drawn to consistency, to mutual openness, to something that grows over time. But when you seek from unresolved need, you're more likely to be drawn to what else familiar, even if that familiarity is rooted in instability. And that's not a failure, it's a pattern. But patterns can be seen. And once they're seen, they can be changed. So the goal is not to avoidance. The goal is to understand yourself deeply enough that their patterns no longer override your clarity. Because when you are no longer driven by the need to resolve the past through the present, you stop mistaking emotional activation for meaningful connection. And you begin to choose relationships that don't just feel intense, but feel right. Because at the end of the day, the most powerful shift you can make is this. You stop asking who can trigger the strongest feelings in you and start choosing who can meet you in the calmest, most consistent truth. And when you step back and look at all of this together, the distance that creates desire, the separation of physical and emotional intimacy, the push-pull cycles, the mirroring, the mystery, and the deep emotional triggers, a very clear picture begins to form. What feels powerful is not always what is healthy. What feels intense is not always what is aligned. And what feels rare is not always what is real. Avoidants are often described as dangerous, but not because they intend harm. The real danger lies in how easily their patterns can distort perception, how they can make inconsistency feel meaningful, distance feel attractive, and emotional unavailability feel like something you need to earn. And if you're not aware of these dynamics, you don't just get caught in the connection, you get caught in your interpretation of it. You start measuring love by intensity instead of consistency. You start valuing unpredictability over clarity. You start chasing emotional highs instead of building emotional stability. But once you see it, truly see it, something shifts. You stop being impressed by what is intermittent. You stop being drawn to what is unclear, and you stop investing in what cannot meet you fully. Because real connection doesn't leave you guessing. It doesn't require you to decode behavior or chase moments. It doesn't ask you to trade your clarity for chemistry. It meets you with presence, with consistency, with emotional availability that doesn't disappear the moment things become real. And that's the standard. So the next time you feel that pull, that intensity, that intrigue, that sense that this feels different, pause for a moment and ask yourself a better question. Not why do I feel this so strongly, but what is this built on? Because when you start asking that question, you move out of illusion and into awareness. And awareness is where your power is. At the end of the day, it's not about avoiding certain people. It's about no longer abandoning yourself in the process of trying to understand them. Because the strongest, most lasting connections in your life will never come from emotional turbulence. They will come from emotional truth.